It is about time to get started. It's so good to be back with you for this course is flying by. This is already our fourth week of 6, and I've enjoyed so much our conversations. Your insights and questions have been just transformative and so welcome. I hope to continue these rich conversations as we move forward together. Before we get started, of course, a hearty happy Mother's Day to all of you mothers out there, and also to all of you mother figures. I realize that many of you are biological mothers, but on top of that, and others have been mother figures to many people in life, to friends, to church members, to confirmands, to just numerous people. And I am confident to say that all of us wouldn't be where we are without our mothers, and the church would not be where it is today without its mother figures and mother leaders all throughout history. So friends, we are grateful for you, mothers and mother figures out there, and so glad to be gathered. This morning, friends, we have a little bit of unfinished business from last week. Last session, as you know, we talked about the poverty and the prophets, and we discussed a number of issues pertaining to what was happening in ancient Israel at the time when prophetic activity was on the rise. That was the 8th century, and we saw that one of the chief social issues or economic issues was this idea of land distribution. We saw that at about the time the prophets were arising, land was being accumulated in the hands of a very small percentage of wealthy elite in the ancient world. They would have been connected to the royal administration in one way or another. Here's our big bonus question for today. Does anyone remember that really fun, long Latin term that describes the accumulation of land in the hands of a few? Does anyone remember that? Bright, you might know that term from previous discussions.
I'll give somebody else a chance if they want it. Latifundalization or something.
Yeah, very good. Latifundalization. It's just so fun to say. There's really no need to teach you that word other than it's just a fun word to say. It's latifundi in Latin means large estate. So latifundalization is the creation of large estates. And that's exactly what we saw happening in the 8th century. And so we worked through that idea. We saw its potential impacts on how economic life functioned in the ancient world. And then we began to look at how the prophets responded to the particular problem that latifundalization caused. And we saw that one of their tasks was to puncture the pretense that everything was as it should be. That is, they needed to bring to light the issue and the problems of the day and not to act as if this was inevitable or this is the only reality that anyone could ever imagine. And that's today, and as we think of the church's prophetic witness today, I think that's an important reminder, the role of the church to shine light on where there are problems, to help create awareness, not always in a finger wagging, condemning way, but just to create awareness and knowledge around where in our world healing is needed. And that's one of the primary roles of the prophets, to draw attention to where healing is needed. And so what we're going to do in a second is I want to turn to the second task of a prophet with respect to the social and economic and religious conditions of the day. This is the one we often forget. So I want to highlight it. We'll take about 10 minutes on that. And then we're going to take a look at poverty and the Psalms. Now, that's sort of an odd topic. And if you read a book on poverty in the Bible, and there aren't that many out there, by the way, the Psalms are not central to that conversation. But I think there are a couple really important things that we need to keep in mind about poverty and how the Psalms intersects with that topic. So we're going to take a look and take a dive into the Psalms through the course of this study. So with that orientation said, let me offer a word of prayer, and then we will dive right in. Please join me in prayer. God, our mother, our creator, our sustainer, and our spirit, you have, in the beginning of time, you fluttered over the waters of creation and brought forth life and light. And since that time, you've continued to nurture life and light in so many different ways through the vibrancy of your spirit, through the care of human mothers who have nurtured the faithful and have guided your flock in so many different ways down through the centuries. God, we pray with gratitude for the mothers and the mother figures in this room. We celebrate their love, their patience, the depth of their fidelity to their families and to you. And we pray, Lord, that you would bless them, you would help them feel loved and appreciated and celebrated, not only on this day, but on every day that they live. And God, we pray in these conversations today that you, Lord Spirit, would open up our curiosity. You would help us see again these ancient texts with fresh eyes, and that we might embrace them as a guide for your church and for our lives of discipleship today. We pray this in your name. Amen. All right, friends, let me go ahead and share my screen here, and we will reconvene with the prophets. So prayers said, fingers crossed. Here's my share. That come through all right for y'all? Looks good? All right, so the prophetic task. Now, I'm framing this as the prophetic task in response to the economic and social issues of the day. But I want to also say that I would name these two tasks would be the same had we been talking about the pressing religious issues of the day. So this is not particular to economics, but because of our conversation, I'm applying it to the economic systems. So the first one, come back here. Oops, sorry, we jump back. Here's a quick review of last week's study if you missed it. Hope you're catching all of this. So the first task is to puncture the pretense of everything as it should be. We looked at some passages in Amos in which that idea came into play. We looked at some stats on wealth and poverty from the ancient world, and you have a copy of these slides. So if you want to revisit any of these stats from our, I think I said ancient world, our contemporary world, they're there for your perusal. But the second task I want to focus on today is this: to energize hope for a radically different future. To energize hope for a radically different future. Friends, I think that we often forget this aspect of the prophetic task because we've come to see the prophets as social critics. And that word critic in modern English can sometimes just imply critique. And certainly being a critic does involve critique. It involves analyzing problems, showing where the problem lies, bringing to light what's misfunctioning, what's not working properly in the system, be it religious or social or economic. And that certainly is a part of the prophets. But helpful criticism also involves the suggestion of generative solutions. It's not just saying, hey, there's a problem and shame on all of those who are part of the problem, but it's also beginning to point in the direction of concrete realities or concrete solutions that will change the reality on the ground. And this is something, as a little, if I may, sermonic side point, is that I think we sometimes get in the church, especially the more progressive liberal church, which I consider myself a part of, and I suspect many of you do as well. We do a good job at the criticism, but we often don't follow with the generative, constructive proposal for how things ought to be different. Or at least I want to say that I think that's a growing edge for us, and it's something that we can be inspired by through the model of the prophets. Well, the prophets did this with respect to poverty. They didn't just wag the finger and show where the problem was. They tried to create a vision for the opposite of poverty. Now, that's an interesting question. If you think, let's shift to the modern world and play with this for a little bit. It's one thing to say what poverty is, right? We showed stats last week about the governmental definition of poverty and so on and so forth. But if I asked you, what is the opposite of poverty? What would you say? How would you describe the opposite of poverty? What does that look like? How do we know when we have faithfully and adequately transformed situations of poverty? What does the other side of poverty look like? There's no right or wrong here, but I'm curious to see what you all would say about that.
Abundance.
Abundance, beautiful, I love that. What other words come to mind?
Say living comfortably.
Okay, good. Comfort and living comfortably. So living with some margin, right? Yeah, great.
I would say sustainability.
Sustainability. That's great, Sheree. So it's not a temporary solution. It's something that lasts and continues.
Wealth.
Wealth. Okay, good.
Hope.
Hope. Yeah, I love that, Leslie. There is sort of an orientation to hope that has to be a part of the solution.
I think you could say sharing. That's not exactly right, but it's an attitude that even if maybe there's not abundance, but at least there's sharing of what is available.
That's great, Tom. I love that. Well put.
I think lack of fear of not being able to sustain.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Fear of scarcity, fear of all of the things that accompany being impoverished. Really good.
Well, Ryan, I keep trying to think on a little more practical level. So many of these things we're naming depend upon actually having enough in the bank. And I keep thinking of this in terms of our efforts to establish and identify a living wage, a minimum wage.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And it's apt because we need to think about what are the economic conditions that would lead to some of the things that you are naming, whether it's a lack of fear or Leslie, your idea of hope or the idea of wealth. All of that is tied up in the question of poverty response. I would add to that, and I don't think this is any different than the trajectory of thoughts that you already are suggesting. I would want to throw in words like dignity, agency. That is, that you are an active agent in your own economic sustainability and well-being. I would add things like mutuality, relationships, self-worth, having a place at the table of important conversations, whether it's in politics, civic life, religion, right? There's a lot that goes in to this definition of what the opposite of poverty is. The reason I'm dwelling on this is not just because the prophets speak about it, but also because as we structure our real on-the-ground ministries that respond to poverty, we need to think about what the opposite of poverty looks like, right? In the church, I think one of our challenges is that we often focus a lot of our work on poverty around good intentions. And I have no doubt that we are just bursting at the seams with good intentions when it comes to poverty relief. But we often don't think as strategically as I think we could about what's the goal, what's the hope for outcome? What if the opposite of poverty is this? How do we begin to cultivate the conditions that lead to the opposite of poverty? One of our challenges is I think we often define poverty simply as a lack of blank, a lack of food, a lack of shelter, a lack of clothing. And so we develop poverty relief ministries that respond to the way that we've defined poverty in the first place. We provide food, we provide shelter, we provide clothing, right? And all of those things, I would argue, are a part of poverty and poverty relief. But if we start understanding the opposite of poverty as things like hope and wealth and lack of fear and dignity, think about how that's going to texture the ways that we need to actually respond to poverty through our ministries, right? It doesn't mean that we necessarily stop the other things we're doing, but now we're invited to think more holistically about how do we surround people who are experiencing poverty with a continuum of care that cultivates, not only provides for what they lack, but then begins to create the conditions that enables them to flourish into the future. Yes.
I wanted to interject, Cindy, I just wanted to interject and say that just completely reminds me of what Buckhead Christian Ministries is able to do. You know, there are a lot of people who, with the right education about how to manage the income that they do have and to save and to put aside, could come out of poverty, and they just don't know how. So the financial programs that are often offered there In addition to, it might be rent assistance or utility assistance until you can get to a sustainable place. I mean, that's the kind of support that's long-term to get someone out of that cycle of their own poverty, I would think. And that's a ministry, of course, that Trinity's very supportive of.
Yeah, that's a nice example, Cindy. And I think what that's doing is beginning to think more holistically about what are the conditions that lead to flourishing. And I think that's the word I'm drawn to as the opposite of poverty. And there's not one right answer to this, right? We could all define the opposite of poverty in different ways and each access the truth of that, I think, very powerfully. But for me, the idea is flourishing, a flourishing community. And note that I'm describing it not as a condition. I'm not saying flourishing individuals. I'm saying flourishing communities, because I think the solution to poverty isn't going to happen with like changing one individual and another and another and another. It will involve that at some level, but that's a means towards the transformation of communities. Communities, as we've seen throughout the prophets and also the law, the solutions to poverty happen at local community levels. It's not just individual acts of charity that support individual poor people. Rather, it's a community responding to needs and creating these conditions that enable people to flourish. I'll just give you one example of that. And maybe the Buckhead Ministries does this as well, Cindy, but one of the things I've learned in my in my need to continue to understand what poverty is like is how important having a government issued ID is to climb out of poverty. It's needed for so many different things, from assistance to housing applications. But many people who are homeless don't have a government issued ID for various reasons. They don't have a mailing address, which makes it really hard then to apply for things that they need. So there's this, and I'm simplifying here, it's more complicated than this, but there's a whole set of like sub conditions that need to be met for someone, even in many cases, to be eligible for the support that is happening either at a governmental or civic or religious level. So that's something that I think we often don't think about as much, or at least not all churches do. So how do we create conditions that enable people to have those prerequisites for full participation in community well-being? Well, the prophets, I think, are addressing this. Now, of course, it's a completely different time. So their image of what a flourishing community looks like is necessarily different than ours, but I think they provide an evocative starting point for us. And they remind us to begin with the end in mind. They remind us to begin with what would be the best case scenario. And then how do we reverse engineer our ministry responses to poverty in light of this new vision, this radical vision for a different future. Here's one place where I think the prophets are giving us a glimpse of that radically different future. It comes at the very end of the book of Isaiah. Now, I should say that the end of Isaiah, the last 10 chapters or so, most scholars think come at a much later point than the first 40 chapters of the book of Isaiah. The first 40 chapters of the book of Isaiah address those 8th century conditions that we talked about last year, or sorry, not last, it seems like a year ago, last week. The last couple chapters are probably exilic or maybe even post-exilic, in that they're looking forward to the return from this time of exile in Babylon. In either case, despite the different historical timeframes, I think the vision they offer is applicable to different times and places. Here's the passage for us to consider. And here, I just simply want to ask, as you hear these words, what stands out to you? What generates hope? And how does this point to a radically different future? So what stands out to you and what generates hope? This is the prophet channeling the words of God. Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. Then you shall cry for help, and he will say, here I am. If you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. What stands out for you? Where do you see hope being generated in this passage?
Brian, I see hope to those of us who have excess. It says, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. We don't know that we need healing. Most of us don't. At least, I put myself in that category. I don't think about needing healing. But that's what the prophet is saying, I think, that I do need healing, and that it'll happen if I radically change my ways.
Wonderful. Great insight there.
What about the Lord saying, here I am? This is where I am.
Yeah, God is there in that process of healing the community and caring for the afflicted and the homeless. God is in that place where that is happening. There God is. What a powerful statement about God's presence and activity in the world.
It's kind of like Matthew 25 a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good, Tom. Great connection. I have to think that Jesus has this text like this in the background when he gives that parable.
I think it's telling that in a lifetime of doing Christian education and studying in seminars and retreats at Montreat, I've never seen this passage before. What does that say about our church, that we have never seen this passage before?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, that gets back to the our very beginning point of this series of why do we miss what the Bible has to say about poverty? Because we have not been trained to look for texts like this. Texts like this are not always front and center in the lectionary, in Sunday school, in children's confirmation. I mean, I have definitely never seen a confirmation curriculum that have included issues in texts like this, but think about how central what this is saying. Lastly, from your observation that this is where God is, this is where the I am is, and I'm thinking too of the connection to all of Jesus's I am statements from the Gospel of John. Here I am in this place. And also look at that very first line. Is not this the fast that I choose? That's a really important framing issue, right? Because it's saying, look, I want your religious devotion, but this is what religious devotion entails. Now, I would say that it's not only what religious devotion entails, but it's interesting that the prophet isn't saying, okay, you've got your religious devotion, but now I also ask you to be advocates for justice in your civic life, right? He doesn't pull those two pieces apart. He's saying acting this way on behalf of the poor is the sort of religious fast, is the act of piety in worship that I desire of you. It's framing all of life and discipleship in terms of this response to community needs, right? Think about how central that is to this conception of what it means to be a spiritual being and a follower of God in this world.
Ryan, that brings to mind to me Jesus saying, do you love me? Well, then feed my sheep.
Feed my sheep. Yeah. And so that's such a good connection. You guys are amazing. So who do you imagine the sheep to be? Who are the sheep in that statement when Jesus says, feed my sheep? Well, I think we often understand sheep as like, well, they're children of the church going through Sunday school class. Well, I think that's absolutely true. I think we are called to feed those sheep. But what if, and this will come up in our next couple of weeks, what if the sheep who are lacking food are actually the poor? And what if in that dialogue at the end of John, Jesus is calling us to feed the poor? Do you love me, Peter? Feed my sheep. tend to those in my flock in this world who are actually hungry, who are actually in need of care. What if we understood it that way? I don't think that's the only way to understand it, but I think we need that as part of our full understanding of what Jesus's words mean for the church today.
I think about the breaking every yoke. In other words, this is all encompassing wherever there's oppression.
Yeah, it's all encompassing, and that includes systems and all of the things. You know, I think if this prophet lived in, 2021 in Atlanta, all of the yoke, every yoke, it sounded like I was making an omelet there. Every yoke I think the prophet would be talking about affordable housing in Atlanta, right? I think the prophet would be addressing some of those systemic issues. They would be addressing living wages, right? And so many other different things that pertain to poverty. So it's what's amazing about this word is that it is, Sam, as you say, like holistic, but then it's also at the same time very personal, right? It brings those two pieces together, because look at the second line of verse 7, and bring the homeless poor into your house. Now that's an interesting statement. He doesn't say, go, contribute money to the governmental plan that's building affordable housing for the poor. Now that might be wholly appropriate and needed, especially in our world. But the prophet personalizes it and says, no, bring the homeless poor into your house. Be in relationship with the poor. Don't just sort of at a financial level contribute money to solutions as much as that's needed, but make poverty personal for you and your family. Get connected personally to this issue.
Ryan, what's interesting to me, and this is picking up on Reynolds' point, is that, until we address injustice and until we really think about oppression, then we're not healed yet.
Yeah.
We're still crying for help. And then, the last line, we are in this state of gloom.
Yeah.
Which is not how I've ever been taught to think about poverty. I'm not gloomy. I'm not in need of help. I'm not oppressed myself. I'm not calling out for help. I'm doing okay. But this is saying we're not doing okay until we address oppression everywhere. So it's action that I had not really thought about, that I'm oppressed as well.
That's right. We are participating in our own healing and liberation through this act of response to poverty. I'm mindful of the words of Martin Luther King Jr. Remember when he says, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. It affects all of us. It's not just a poor people problem. This is actually something our whole community, including each one of us, including folks who are middle class and upper middle class and wealthy and so on and so forth. All of us need healing when it comes to this issue. And we participate in that healing when we engage in these ministries to the poor in this way. So I'm thrilled that y'all are putting your finger on that, because I think that's a central point of what the prophet is saying here.
But Ryan, why, I'm curious, in Isaiah, which I don't know much about, what would be the context of this message that the prophet is saying to people, the well-off, the wealthy, the people who have means, you need help. You're in a state of gloom until you do this. So what would be going on in the world of Isaiah that would sort of make the prophet want to give this message?
Excellent question. I can only answer it briefly given our time, but here's the likely scenario when words like this are uttered. The exile is ending, or is about to end, or has just ended. And remember, not all of Israel was exiled to Babylon. Only the sort of upper 2 to 5% of the people were exiled, because Babylon was only concerned about getting the rich and powerful out of the land, because they were the ones, in the Babylonians' eyes, who could stir up an uprising and actually overthrow their control over Israel. So they deport only the wealthy and the powerful of society. So I think these words from Isaiah are to the wealthy, are to the powerful who are beginning to return from Babylon back to Jerusalem. And I think part of his warning to them is, look, it's not just about return, right? There was celebration about the possibility of return from exile. But I think the prophet's saying, well, it's not enough just to go back. Like, healing needs to happen in our communities. Who has been left behind in the land are the poor. And when you come back, you're going to come into encounter with a community where issues of impoverishment are higher than they've ever been. The one thing we won't fully get to in this course is the effects of the exile on the economic condition of those who remained in the land. It was devastating for them. So I think it's a call to say, look, the work is not done when you go back. When you go back after the exile, that's when the work begins, because you and this community are going to need healing. Now, I'll let you draw your own conclusions to this and connections, but I think this idea of going back being the beginning of the work, not the conclusion, is important for the church as we begin to think about going back after the pandemic. I think going back together and being back for worship and Bible study and other things, I think that's the start. It's not the hoped for conclusion. That's when our work begins for ministry, for healing, for reconciliation, for so many other different things. It's obviously not the same exact circumstances, but I think there's a connection to be made there.
Brian, you think that the prophet is saying when he speaks of the hungry, the homeless, and the naked, and then he says, and not hide yourself from your own kin, is he saying that these are our brothers and sisters?
Yeah, that's right, Reynolds.
These are our kin.
That's right.
I didn't understand that at first, but that would make sense.
Yeah, the word for kin there is achim, which in Hebrew literally means brothers. Now, it's not gendered necessarily in its use. It can mean brothers and sisters, but it's inviting the people who are in exile and are returning back to say, look, you don't know these people because you've been separated from them for 50 years or so. You don't know them, but remember, these are your people. This is not a those people situation that you need to go help. When you go back and feed the hungry and care for the poor, this is family care, right? This is something that you can hear the sort of implicit responsibility to care for one's own kin, right? These people are part of that kin that you need to care for. And so I wonder if part of the problem was, the exiles, this kind of brings me back to the Good Samaritan, right? If the exiles weren't saying, look, I know we're supposed to love our neighbors, but our neighbors are just those people like us who have been in exile, who we have literally been living next to, neighboring with. And the prophet here is saying, no, careful how you define neighbor, because these people are your kin. These people are your neighbors as well. And maybe that was the challenge, to kind of begin to pull apart the ways in which even the Israelite society would have been segmented and separated between the rich and the poor. So that idea of neighboring, I think, is at the heart of it.
Well, it's also them and, we think of them and us as two different parts of society. And the prophet is saying, no, we're all part of the same family.
Yeah. No, that's right. And Leslie, your comment in the chat there is a really important one. It begs the question of who is not our neighbor. Remember, in Leviticus 19, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. And we know that passage, right? Because that's what Jesus repeats when asked, what are the two greatest commandments? He names that as the second greatest commandment. But if we keep reading in Leviticus, what we hear is that later in that same chapter, it says, and love the stranger as yourself. Right? It says, it first says, love your kin as yourself, love your achim, your brother, your fellow Israelite as yourself. And then later, just a few verses later, it says, and love your stranger as yourself. If you put those two together, I think what it's asking us to do is to treat stranger as neighbor. And lastly, to follow on your question, it asks us to dissolve the boundaries that even separate the ideas of stranger and neighbors. It invites us to see all as neighbor and to apply that same ethic of care to strangers, people we don't know and don't literally live next to, that we would to our actual neighbors and people that we feel are our kin. That's a radical ethic. That's really hard to do, but I think that's at the heart of this call.
Ryan, what do you understand the word vindicator to mean in verse 8? Your vindicator shall go.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in this context of kind of the return from the exile, I think it has to do with the idea that God vindicates Israel, kind of restores them and redeems them after this period of exile and gloom and darkness, that God is part of that restoration. But I think here what we're seeing is that there's a particular activity and way of embodying God's covenant and God's community that is part of God's vindication, that God will be with you. God will be present with you. Here I am, when you enact this way of being together, when you understand your religious devotion or your fast in these terms. Friends, this is a rich conversation, and I really think we could probably spend the rest of our time on this passage. But for sake of wanting to get a little more coverage, I want to transition us right now to the Psalms. And I want to have a couple things to say about the Psalms. I really appreciate your insights on this. And by the way, if you're looking for more passages like this, like Isaiah 58, that I think really leans into this hope for a radically different future, especially as it regards flourishing communities, I would recommend to you the last probably 10 chapters of the book of Isaiah, from Isaiah 56 to Isaiah 65. Those 10 chapters would be a wonderful place to meditate and study upon. Isaiah 56 being high on that list, but there are many other passages. And just as a point of connection, I think it'll come up in a couple weeks when we look at the Gospel of Luke. But it's no accident and it's no surprise that in Jesus's first sermon, his first sermon at the synagogue in Nazareth, which is pictured in Luke 4, Jesus is quoting from these last chapters of Isaiah. He's quoting directly from these passages to define what his ministry will be, to define what it means to bring good news, what it means to bring the gospel, the euangelion in Greek, what it means to bring that to bear in his ministry. He's turning back to these passages and saying, this is the gospel. This is what I will embody. This is what I will preach. So put those two in conversation, and I think we'll come back to it when we get to Luke. Give me one moment here. I need to change out of these slides and bring up my other one. So this will be I should have some like good background music playing here, but I don't. So just give me 1 second as I transition here. All right. Let me get rid of that. All right. So I think this should come up in just a second. All right, let me reshare my screen. And this should, with any luck, be session 4. Did that come through okay? The Psalms.
Oh.
All right. So let's think about the Psalms first, just for a minute. Gosh, I wish we had 6 weeks just to talk about the Psalms in general, but let me give you the 60-second version of that and just kind of let us remember what we're reading when we're reading the Psalms. Because friends, the Psalms are really different than the rest of the Old Testament and also the rest of the New Testament. The Psalms is, as you know, ancient Israel's prayer book. And in that sense, while most of the Old Testament is God's words to Israel, I want to suggest that the Psalms are better understood as Israel's words to God, right? Israel's words to God. It's their prayer book. I talk about it as revelation from the bottom up. Just because these are Israel's prayers, it doesn't mean that they're not inspired or they're not revelatory, but as opposed to the words of the prophets and the law, which I understand is revelation from the top down, directly from God, directly from Sinai, directly from prophets. Here we have revelation from the bottom up. It's revelation through the prayers and heartfelt experiences of Israel. These prayers, as you know, having encountered the Psalms in church and worship and private devotion, these prayers are based in life experiences. These are not some, practiced recital of the creeds and confessions, right? It's not even like the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed or something like that, where these are set words that have been memorized and passed on and passed on and passed on. I think these are spontaneous prayers. These are prayers that emerge from experiences in the world. And as such, they cover the full range of emotions, the full range of people's life, from joy and gratitude to the depths of despair and grief. Our theologian, Presbyterian theologian, if you will, John Calvin, once described the Psalms, and I love this, as reflecting the full anatomy of the soul. Isn't that great imagery? The Psalms reflect the full anatomy of the soul. They don't hide anything. They don't only reflect kind of the nice and neat, put together, show up to church on Sunday morning with your suit and dress and maybe even your hat. It's kind of reflecting back to God the full reality of our lives, the grief, the despair, the stuff that doesn't feel tidied up and put together. I would kind of pull on and play with Calvin's idea and say that that in the Psalms, the prayer spills her guts, if you will, before God. Right? The prayer questions God with brutal honesty. It's a faith unfiltered that we find in the prayers. Now, the reason I'm highlighting all of this and kind of reorienting you back to the Psalms is the question for us in this study is, what is in these prayers that express grief and distress and anguish? We often call them prayers of lament. We can ask, what is causing the anguish, distress, and lament in the first place? What are the lived experiences that generate prayers like the prayers of lament? What drives the psalmist to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Like, what has happened that has led to that moment? Right? That's what I want to focus on here for just a few minutes. Now, it's a tough question because the Psalms don't give us an answer. The Psalms don't lay out in detailed precision what actually has led to the need for a prayer like that. And I think that's intentional, right? I think the ambiguity of the circumstances that lie behind prayers of lament actually offer us an opportunity. Right? Because these prayers are not specific, they allow us to use these words as our own words in response to conditions that we face in the world. So their timelessness, if you will, contributes to their timeliness in our lives. It's because they have this timely quality that they can be used and reused in many different ways in the life of the church in our own lives. That said, I do think we can gain some insights into what is lying behind the prayers of lament. And one way we're going to do that is we're going to take a look at some of the vocabulary that describes the prayer, and I do prayer with a dash to distinguish it from prayer. The person praying, the prayer, in the Psalms of Lament are primarily described with 4 terms. And this is transliteration of the Hebrew terms, ani, anav, dal, and evyon. Now, you don't necessarily need to remember these 4 terms as they're said in Hebrew, but I want to take a look at what these 4 terms mean, because I think that gives us some insight into what the prayer is experiencing. The fact that they are described in this way gives us insight into what they might have been experiencing. And probably not surprising to you, spoiler alert, each of these 4 terms actually gets at economic and social realities. They get at economic and social realities. Here's a quick glimpse. The word ani means in Hebrew to be without property. And as we've already seen in this study, if one does not have property in the ancient world, one is almost by definition poor. In an agrarian subsistence farming economy, to not have land means that you are poor, and not just that you are poor, but Cecilia's kids are poor, and Eleanor's grandkids are poor, and Anne's great grandkids are poor, because property is passed on through generation through generation. So not having property means you're poor. And that's what ani means, to be without property. It means, throughout the rest of the Old Testament, it refers to people in low social standing, Now, anav is very closely related. It means most specifically to be bowed, as in bowed down. Now, it can be used as a posture of worship. That is, one bows down in an act of worship. But there's actually another Hebrew term that means to bow oneself down before the Lord. And it's not this term. This term, anav, when it speaks of bowed, it means more often bowed by one's circumstances. That is, imagine, kind of have it in your mind, maybe a picture of someone with a very heavy burden on their back. Let's say in modern terms, it would be a really heavy hiking backpack or something like that. Something that was so heavy that it literally and physically bows you down. I think metaphorically, this term is being used to describe the effect and the weight of poverty on people who are without means and without land in the world. This word anav is then used interchangeably with ani. And in fact, if you look outside of the Bible, to other Semitic languages, people who use Hebrew or languages related to Hebrew, anav is sort of the primary term for poverty outside of biblical literature. So these first two, clearly economic terms, at least at their heart. Dal, the next one, the third one on your screen there, comes from a verb, dalal. You can hear the similarity, dal, dalal. The verb dalal means to become thin or sparse. I think in some ways it's a physical description of the effects of poverty. One without nourishment, one without food, one without clothing and home and things like that becomes emaciated, really. And that's what dalal means, to become emaciated. And so dal, the noun that's related to that verb, describes the result of this action of emaciation. So by extension, then, it describes the low, the powerlessness, those who are said to be insignificant in society. Then fourth and finally, we have evion, that term there at the bottom of your screen, evion. The etymology of the origins of this word are a little bit uncertain, but it likely comes from a verb, ava, evion. You can hear the connection there again in the sounds, but the verb ava, if that is the root of evion, ava means to be in need, or more specifically, to lack something. So therefore, based on that, evion often has the connotation of destitute, or as someone who is completely dependent on others for their subsistence and their survival. Now, in this way, and there's more to be said about all four of these terms, this is just a brief overview. One can read all of these four terms metaphorically, in the sense that we can use these terms to describe someone who is spiritually impoverished, or someone who's experiencing a crisis that's not necessarily economic or material in orientation. Hear me, that is a complete possible reading. It is not wrong to read these terms these ways. What I'm trying to highlight is that their original connotations, if you were an ancient Israelite living in 600 BCE, when you would have heard these four terms, your first instinct would have been to think about economic and social realities. That's what the bells would have gone off in your head, that these were economic and social terms. Not excluding other possibilities, but that's the origins of these ideas. Now, all of these four terms have overlapping semantic domains, which is a fancy way of saying they can be used interchangeably. So consider Psalm 113:7. He raises the poor, dal, from the dust, and he lifts the needy, evion, from the ash heap. In Hebrew poetry, we often have two lines that say the same idea with slightly different words. It's called parallelism. And that's what we're seeing here in Psalm 113:7. We're seeing a parallelism in which the word dal and the word evion mean essentially the same thing. And this happens again and again with these terms. They also can be used back to back, as in Psalm 40:17. As for me, this is the prayer of the lament. I am poor, ani, and needy, evion. In describing herself as poor and needy, the psalmist isn't saying, I'm poor and needy as if they were two separate things. These are parallel and mirroring concepts. This is your fun, long technical term for today. I'd like to try to just throw one of them in there just to keep you on your toes each week. The fun word for that is hendiades. And if we have any English teachers out there or kind of grammarians, you'll know that a hendiades is a phrase, like in English. If you were to say like, oh, this is I'm thinking of an example. This is something like nice and warm. This blanket is nice and warm. Where you're not saying that this blanket is nice and it also happens to be warm. A hendiades, you kind of combine those two words and it kind of means something like nicely warm. They're not really two different ideas, but they're two ideas that are stuck together. So in calling himself poor and needy, the psalmist is really saying, I'm the impoverished poor, or I'm the needy poor. It's two ideas that build on each other rather than say different things. So in light of all of this, in light of the semantic usage of these terms, this raises the possibility and maybe even the probability that the person praying the prayer of lament is someone experiencing poverty. The person praying the prayers of lament is someone experiencing poverty. And by extension, then, we can read the prayers of lament as prayers of the poor. Now, this is something that I have to say, friends, that I have studied the Old Testament now for a number of years. I've been in school too long to admit, and I have never, until very recently, begun to think of the prayers of lament as prayers of the poor. Again, I want to stress that these are not the only way to read these prayers, but I think I want to invite you into an experiment where you listen back to the prayers to the Psalms of Lament and imagine them as if they were being prayed by someone who's experiencing material poverty. Are you with me on that idea? I want to try it out and just get a sense of what this feels like for you to listen to a prayer of lament as a prayer for the poor. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read part of a very prominent Psalm of Lament, Psalm 22. And as I do so, I'm just going to give you some images of actual people experiencing poverty. And just want to see what this does for you, what thoughts it brings up, what feelings it brings up. So here it is. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me. They shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver, they say. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near and there is no one to help. I am poured out like water. All of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breasts. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs are all around me. A company of evildoers encircles me. My hands and feet have shriveled. I can count all of my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothes they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far away. O my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. For he did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me, but heard when I cried to him. From you comes my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will pay before those who fear him. The poor shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek God shall praise the Lord. Friends, what was it like to hear these words, this prayer of lament from Psalm 22, which, as you know, is on Jesus's lips in the last moment of the Passion narrative? What is it like to hear that prayer of lament as a prayer of the poor? Jump out of our screen here so we can see one another. What's it like for you?
If you listen in that way, it actually becomes difficult for the person who has to hear it, if your mind is that you're hearing it for the poor, because your heart is like, what can I do? So when you shared the image of the woman, casually going to work and walking by, I have an office at Georgia State, and if you've ever been down in the heart of Georgia State, that's exactly what it looks like. And if you start thinking about what we're talking about today as how do we change this as a community? What can I do? I have my Starbucks, I'm going into work, instead of just changing the one, what are we doing as a community for that? And so when you hear that, it's like hearing that plea, but I'm still left with the question on what do we do about it?
Yeah. Thank you, Cindy.
What's occurred to me is the people who taunt are like those who say today, it's their fault. It's bad behavior that's led them to this kind of dire strait. They ought to be able to pick themselves up. I've been able to.
Thanks, Sam. Any other thoughts on this experience of reading this prayer, but thinking of it as words of the poor?
It's painful.
Painful. Yeah. I sometimes think of when I hear the words of Psalm 22 and I hear words like mocking and the bulls of Bashan surround me, I think of like active antagonism, right? But when you put up those pictures, one can reimagine that language as passive indifference, right? It's not that, you kick the person or stole their cloak as you walked by, but it's the fact that you don't even see them, right? That they're invisible, that their voices are not heard. And I think that's one of the powerful things that happens for me, at least, in hearing the prayers of lament as prayers for the poor. I'm forced to hear or overhear the words of people that I often don't engage in conversation. I get to hear their experience, even though in many ways my life, and this is a confession more than anything, is insulated from the realities of the poor. Yes, I pass some poor people in various different places I go in Atlanta, but really my life is insulated from their experience. I don't hear them saying these words, but these Psalms force me to hear, force me to encounter the reality of poverty and how painful it is. These are painful words. These are words of someone who's wondering, will I make it through? Will there be another side to this experience? That's not a foregone conclusion, I think, as we read through the words of this prayer. So friends, mindful of our time, here's what I want to do. I want to end with two invitations to you with respect to the Psalms and poverty. The first is go find other Psalms of lament. There's a lot of them out there. In fact, there are more Psalms of lament than there are any other type of Psalm. There's more Psalms of lament, 40, I believe it's over 40%. It might be as much as 45. I don't remember the exact figure. Over 40% of the Psalter are prayers of lament. Now, that's an interesting fact, in part because in the Revised Common Lectionary, and I don't remember if Trinity uses the Revised Common Lectionary to structure its sermons, but the Revised Common Lectionary, and certainly the Glory to God hymnal that we all use, leaves out most Psalms of lament. Now that's striking because they're the most frequently occurring type of psalm, and they almost never show up in our hymnal and our Revised Common Lectionary. So go back and find those Psalms of lament. You can do a Google search and just find a list of them. That's not, which ones are Psalms of lament are not very controversial, and read them as prayers of the poor. And just think and meditate about what is it like to hear these as words that actual poor people say to God. And what does that mean for you to hear those words? What does it mean for you to overhear those words? And then here's the second thing. And I have to say that this is harder and more painful and more risky. But if you feel up for it, and I hope you might, I would encourage you to do what Ellen Davis, an Old Testament professor at Duke Divinity School, says, and I love this description. She says, have the courage to turn the Bible 180 degrees. And what she means by that is, don't imagine yourself as the one praying this psalm, right? Like that would be possible. You could read these prayers of lament and you imagine yourself as the person lamenting. Davis says, take the risk to imagine yourself as the person this psalm is being prayed about. That is, you are not the person lamenting, you are the person being lamented about. Right? You are the bulls of Bashan who encircle me. You are the one who walks by and ignores, right? Now, this is painful, right? Because it puts burden on us. But I think, friends, that we need to hear these Psalms as being about us at some level, the non-poor. How have our actions or inactivity contributed to conditions that cause prayers like this to exist in the first place? It's painful, it's hard, but I would invite you to take some time to experiment with that. And this is not an exercise in beating ourselves up or feeling guilty. Believe me, as an ex-Italian Catholic, like I get all the guilt stuff. Like I can guilt myself under the table, anyone under the table. That's not the point of this, but I do want us to have some sense in which we have responsibility. The church and we as disciples of Christ have responsibilities to hear these prayers, to name the ways we have contributed to these systems, and then to be active in transformation, to lean into that hope that the prophets give us, and to create a different world where prayers like this are less frequent and less necessary. So they're my two invitations for you. Next week, there's a few things I want to also say about the Psalms, and then I want to turn to the Proverbs, another challenging place to turn, and I'll show you why next week. And then we'll kind of use those two to cap off our Old Testament view of the topic of poverty. So friends, this is it. We're going to wrap things up. I'm going to hang on and hang out for a little bit longer. If you want to stay on and chat, I'm happy to do so. But this will officially wrap up today's study if you need to move on either to Mother's Day celebrations or to worship or to both. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you again for your insights and questions. It's just, as a point of personal privilege, it is just a joy to work with you all, and I'm so grateful for this chance. So friends, have a great week. I'm going to hang out, so stay on or log off as needed, and we will see you again next week.
Is that Trinity?
That was.
Thank you so much, everybody. And Ryan, this is fabulous.
Ryan,
You can all unmute and talk.
Ryan,
I wanted to.
oh, excuse me.
Go ahead.
Go on. Go ahead, Corrigan.
Okay, I wanted to ask. So, are seminary students at this point learning these things? Like,
this could get me in trouble. Have we stopped recording this session?
We won't tell. We promise. We promise. We won't tell.
I have to say that I think the answer is no. I mean, I went to Princeton Seminary, which is a wonderful seminary, arguably one of the best especially in its biblical studies side of things. And I took way more Old Testament courses than I ought to have, or I should say than was required. And not once did I hear the issue of poverty and economics raised. Now, I don't mean that as a condemnation of my professors, who were amazing people, great scholars, deeply in love with the church and connected to the church. It just isn't where Western modern Christianity has focused its energy, especially Protestant Western modern Christianity. My hope is that it would be impossible for someone to graduate with a seminary degree and not have a course on poverty. I just think in light of how big the problem of poverty is in our world, I think it's and this is what will get me in trouble, good trouble, hopefully as John Lewis would say. But I just think it's irresponsible to not be engaging these questions. The problem is too big in our world. And frankly, and now I'm definitely skating into dangerous territory. You know, we are really good nowadays, at least recently, about addressing issues of racial injustice. But racial injustice, as you know, is not this like siloed problem. Like racial injustice has everything to do with economics and social standing. Like one cannot, I think, talk about racial injustice without talking about economics. Remember, I mean, I might have mentioned this to you all. Remember the famous "I Had a Dream" speech. That was a march on Washington about jobs. It wasn't a march on Washington about race. Now, it was a march on Washington about race, but King and others in the civil rights movement knew that you cannot move one piece without the other. You cannot advance issues of racial justice without addressing economics and vice versa. So I think that's the growing edge for seminaries and for churches to realize that if we want to talk about race, we have to be talking about economics right alongside with it.
Thanks. Appreciate the answer.
Ryan, I am so anxious for my church, and I think all churches, to help relieve our ignorance about what these systems are that cause the terrible imbalance of wealth in our country. Because we've all been lulled into thinking, as they did apparently in ancient Israel, that everything is just the way it is because that's the way it is. And I think we really need help. I need help because I don't understand what's behind a lot of that. And I don't know how. We do a pretty good job, I think, at Trinity of trying to educate our members about issues like this. But as I pointed out earlier, we get a good bit of feedback sometimes about meddling in politics.
Yeah, it's hard, and I feel all of that, and I'm so hopeful, though, that the church is precisely the institution in the world that can make a difference in poverty, right? We have the spiritual tools, we have the scriptures that orient us to this, we have the mission mindset that orients us to this, we have the ethical framework, and we have Jesus, we have God incarnate who has demonstrated so much to us. Like, we can be radical instruments of change, but it's going to require going back to scriptures and seeing this. It's going to require some tough conversations about the church not being partisan. I think we need to insist on the church not being partisan, but on the church being involved in issues beyond who goes to heaven and what age should we baptize someone, right? I mean, not to make light of those issues, but the church has gotten, we have siloed ourselves to a small subset of issues. It used to be who can marry who and who can be ministers. But now I think we are poised to open those boundaries even further and just have some honest conversations about this.
Eve.
Yeah, I was going to suggest as prophets of today, some of the current writers, and the one I'm really particularly thinking of to help us with this mindset. How many of you are familiar with the Sum of Us, which is by Heather McGee? And it is about, I mean, it is a lot about race, but it's also about poverty. She sort of starts off with, why can't we have the good thing? Why can't we, she's talking about her race, why can't we have the good things that the other people have? So I suggest that as a way to help us see the path.
That's good, Eve. Thank you for that. There are some good books out there on poverty. I've mentioned some of them, I've referenced some of them to you in the suggested readings. The stuff from Bob Lupton is great. Shane Claiborne is someone from Philadelphia area who really has taken a vow of poverty. He's an extraordinary example of an individual who's just engaged with care for the poor at his heart. And so some of his writings can be really helpful too. Charlie.
you said the seminaries are real good about defining and pointing out the biblical view on poverty, and then it gets down to, well, what can society do? And immediately you jump track to capitalism, and all of a sudden everybody goes off the tracks, because do you try to say, well, let's try to see what can capitalism is our system, and what can we do with that and poverty, or do we start attacking and say, no, we've got to now get rid of capitalism, and so then everything explodes, and the holy people go one way, and the wealthy people go the same way.
Right. Yeah, Charlie, that's a good point. And I will admit that I am not an economist. And so in a course like this, I don't think I ever use the words like capitalism or socialism or any other economic system, because I don't feel qualified to really address those systems. And personally, I don't think the solution is, let me put it this way. I think we can make a real difference in poverty at some level beneath going from capitalism to socialism or some other form, right? I mean, I'll let the economists debate about, what those economic systems mean and how they affect, poverty and wealth and all those other things. I think what scripture offers us, and by the way, all of these terms, socialism, capitalism, they're completely anachronistic for scripture. I mean, the ancient economy was not socialism, but it wasn't capitalism either. So I don't think the solution is to pick one and that's going to solve it. I think the solution comes in the form of like local community action. And I think that's what the prophets and the law in particular, and Jesus for that matter, I think that's what they are picturing. Jesus isn't saying, okay, let's go and lobby Rome for a different taxation system here in the Galilee. Now, that would have made a difference, no doubt, as we'll see in a couple of weeks. But Jesus's action was oriented around how does the community of the faithful respond to the given condition. So, Charlie, my view is a little bit of a both and. We might need to do some up the stream, up the chain lobbying for big systemic, for differences. That's not my area of expertise. And so I leave that to others. I think what we can do, and where scripture focuses its energy on, is on local community action, which is not individual. It happens at the level of systems, but not quite at the level of capitalism versus socialism or some other such conversation.
And this local community, what's the size, or what is how big does a local community encompass? A city, a state?
I think it can vary. I mean, Jesus's local communities, Capernaum and Nazareth and places like that. I mean, of course, in comparison to modern standards, they were really, really small, like, maybe 1,000. So they were pretty small communities. In Atlanta, what does that look like? Well, I mean, I could imagine a church like Trinity having an influence on questions about poverty in the greater Atlanta metro area. Let's say, especially if it was about wages or living wages or affordable housing. I think, though, in other circumstances, even like much more local responses make more sense. Like the immediate neighborhoods in which churches either exist or minister to. And so I don't know how you all would I would leave that to churches. Go ahead, Charlie. Or someone else is jumping in.
Well, we had a poverty class a couple of years back, and somebody raised the question, and I won't say who it was. How much are we paying our janitors, our cleaning staff? And that ended it. That literally ended the conversation.
Yeah. They're dangerous conversations, but yet they are faithful conversations, or they're conversations filled with faith. And I do not pretend to have easy answers to these, but asking questions about, what is the wealth gap even within church life and church staff? What are we paying living wages to everyone on staff at our churches? And what are we paying our head of staff with respect to other people on staff? I mean, again, I don't pretend as if I have answers or some simple, well, here's how you do it, and this is the only just way to do it. There probably are multiple approaches. I think the questions are faithful, and the questions are ones that have to be asked, and they're hard, and it takes a lot of courage to ask those questions and to dive into those waters, in part because I think there's a church culture in like modern Protestant Christianity that it's not polite to talk about money, or that it's not even like money is like somehow off limits from faith. And I'm trying to suggest that that's not at all the way in which Scripture views it, that questions of how you deal with money and how you respond to the poor, like the prophets didn't have this distinction between like social action and religious devotion, as I was suggesting earlier. Like, I think a prophet would be really confused by our distinction between those two terms. In fact, I think a prophet would have been deeply confused by the idea of social justice, not because they would disagreed, but because I just don't think they would have separated it out from religious devotion in the ways that sometimes the modern church does. The prophet would just say, yeah, it's all social justice, or it's all religious devotion. And why are we even talking about these separate things? It's just devotion. It's just this is what it means to be devoted to God, is to live in this way with respect to poor in your community.
Ryan,
I'm getting on some soapboxes. I apologize for that this morning.
well, it's a good soapbox. But to me, this whole thing, speaking of simplification, comes down to what is your concept of God? Is God a purely spiritual, holy general manager out there somewhere? Or is God the creative life spirit? And why would Jesus say, I came that you would have life and have life abundantly?
Yeah.
We are here to enhance and make life as pleasant as possible for everybody.
Mm-hmm. I mean, isn't that the whole point of the two greatest commandments? Like, yeah. What is your concept of God? What is your concept of neighbor? Or what is your orientation to God? And what is your orientation to neighbor? Could it be that Christianity is no more complicated than that? And yet, to dig into those two questions, there's a lot there. There's a lot of complexity, and there's a lot of difficulty and challenge in our complex world around those questions. But maybe it's that simple in terms of what we are called to do and to be in the world.
Hey, Ryan, I had a question on the Psalms and the perspective of thinking about the Psalms of Lament being actually from the poor, and then the images you use. I thought that was really effective. But I wonder, I mean, I've always thought of the Psalms as being kind of a, priestly, literary, somebody's writing them that's got some ability to, they're not necessarily looking for their next meal. They're in a position to compose a literary work, inspired, true, but still within that context. So how does that fit? Are the Psalms written for the poor or by the poor?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm going to give you the unsatisfactory answer of saying yes, it's both. And here's what I mean by that: that you're 100% right that someone experiencing poverty, we have to remember, first of all, that most people in the ancient world were not literate. They could not read, at least beyond some like random words or their name, and they could not write, at least again, beyond some rudimentary level. So anything that we find in the Bible, which of course is all written, would have been written by someone, Tom, who is, a trained scribe in the priestly class, who would almost by definition not have been poor or powerless. So that part of it is true. So I think the actual authors, people who put, pen to paper, for these Psalms were exactly as you described, priests. But here's what I think. I think these priests are writing these prayers as a reflection of what they heard uttered in a temple context. Now, they might be kind of, bringing their own language to it, right? I'm not saying it's a verbatim, like courtroom copy, word for word of what someone prayed, but I think these are the types of prayers that a priest would have overheard very commonly in a worship setting, in a temple setting. So I think behind these words are words of the poor, even if the person writing them was not poor. So that's why I think it's a little bit of a both and in that case.
Thank you.
Friends, I need to jump off for my next thing. This has been a great conversation. I love our time together in the formal sessions, but I also equally love this time to informally talk and the questions and ideas you bring to the table. This is great stuff. I'm so excited to continue next week. I'm already so sad that this study is almost ending. I think I tried to talk Bright into the much longer 16-week study, but I know that that's not quite possible with our schedules. Friends, thank you. Have a great day. Enjoy your mothers or mother figures, hopefully if they're still around, and we will see you next week as we continue.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Wonderful.